It is a sport that has been around even before the NFL and is one of the biggest sports in the world. In fact, the United States has won 2 Olympic gold medals dating back to the 1920s, and it's called a hooligan's game played by gentlemen. My guest on this episode will share his story with rugby, how he played the game internationally, and how he's now working to grow the sport here in the United States. Next on Sports in the Making. Thank you for joining me on Sports in the Making, a podcast where we find out what people in the sports and broadcasting industry do, how they've made an impact in the sports world, and how it all comes together. I'm your host, Don Cardona, and this is episode number 20. My guest on this episode played American football through college and was offered a contract to play professional football by the Minnesota Vikings. At about the same time, and as a way to stay in shape, he took up rugby and wound up getting a contract offer to play in England for the Bath team, and decided to pursue that sport overseas, igniting his love for the sport that's lasted decades. He's carried that passion back with him domestically and is now a key figure in rugby's growth to new and existing fans here in the United States. We'll talk about what he does with rugby for the Anschutz Entertainment Group, otherwise known as AEG, what the differences between rugby and American football are, a little bit about its history here in the United States, and the future for this sport that has such a rich culture around the world. This is my conversation with Dan Lyle, Director of Rugby for AEG. Hey, Dan, thank you so much for joining me to talk rugby today. A little bit about your career and the future of rugby.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
So I want to talk first about what your role at AEG is with rugby.
AEG, arguably one of the, or if not the largest sports entertainment company on the planet, was bumping into the sport of rugby on a global basis. You know, we have stadiums and arenas and interest and different things that we do around the world, and in Europe and Australasia and Asia and South America and different places, let alone the US, kept bumping into people that were like, "Hey, do you do rugby, or what's do you know about it?" And so I had, in Denver, Colorado, where I live, there are 2 of the biggest sports entertainment groups, at least parts of them. One is Kroenke Sports Entertainment. Everyone knows they're building the new LA Rams and Chargers SoFi Arena, but here in Denver, it's the Nuggets and the Avalanche and the Rapids and MLS.
Right.
And also the Anschutz Corporation, which is AEG, is is an offshoot of the Anschutz Corporation, owned by Phil Anschutz, so that group is based here in Denver. So I started meeting some people in both of those organizations while I was doing rugby and event marketing and different things for my previous employer, and just kind of started to have conversations with people about what the sport looked like. And so all things led to kind of a, like anything in life, a bit of a happenstance, run-ins, meet people, and ultimately AEG said, "Hey, why don't we start a division?" The irony of that is that my father is a retired general officer, right? And he was a assistant division commander, which is 10,000 troops and tanks and helicopters and all that stuff. And he said to me one day, "Well, what is this job?" And I said, "Well, I'm creating and starting the rugby division for AEG." He goes, "Well, how big is that?" And I said, "Well, it's me." So it's grown over the last couple of years, but it's that's the embryo to toddler stage.
So my background with rugby is I really didn't know anything about it until I started working at Universal Sports Network, which we covered, a little bit of Rugby Union and Rugby Sevens. Can you give me a brief description of the difference between rugby and, say, American football?
Yeah, it's probably the best comparison because people think it's a like for like. The actual playing of rugby feels more like the combination of basketball and soccer with a little bit of the physicality or proprioception of American football. But rugby predates football, right? All the language, the scrimmage line came from the scrum, where everybody knows they push against each other and the ball is put in the middle. That's the restart, just like the center snapping the ball, and the flankers are kind of like the wideouts, and the backs are kind of like the receivers and the quarterback and the halfbacks and things like that. So everything came from them. So once you watch it and you start can create some analogous dialogue. You see the two sports, but Naismith, who invented basketball, was also a rugby player at McGill, and so the flow of basketball and putting people through gaps and playing team defense, and of course the rules of association football, which became soccer, the association soccer, those rules. So the Harvards and McGills and Yales and all that stuff were in America. We're playing some form of soccer, some form of rugby that evolved into some sport of American football. So if you look at that, getting the ball down the field and putting the ball into a goal or over a line, you can pretty much understand it pretty quickly in that regard. But in rugby, there's two distinct versions of the game. There's 15 on 15, which is very much like American football, 80 minutes, gladiatorial, war of attrition, all that stuff. And then the Olympic version, which is 7 on 7, same size field, 7 players, a lot of more scoring, a lot of quickness, a lot of pace, over 7-minute halves. So you can play multiple games on a day, which is more conducive to a 2 or 3 day tournament for the Olympic Games. So, I just instruct people. I said, think of option quarterbacks, point guards meets, a tight end or a linebacker.
It's a fun sport to watch, especially, the excitement of Rugby Sevens and how fast it is. The one thing that I guess always grabs my attention with it, and it seems very simple, but the numbering for each position, with any American football, players get to select their numbers, but in rugby, you have a number assigned to the position you're playing. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Both in 15s and 7s. A little bit more flexibility in 7s, but yeah, pretty close.
And so if you can, and I know we don't have a heck of a lot of time, but can you explain what position, let's just go with 7s because 15s obviously take too long, but position 1 through position 7 in rugby, how would you describe what each position does?
Well, there's a bit of a egalitarian system once the quote unquote set pieces are done, right? The kickoffs or the scrums or the lineouts, right? So generally 1, 2, 3 are the scrum, and they're the front row, and they are the line out forward. They're forwards in 7s, right? So they're probably have a little bit more, a little bit bigger, a little bit more physicality, and then the next 4 are the backs, the 9s, the 4, 5, 6, 7 are those guys there. But the thing about 7s is there's no place to hide, right? You've got this big wide field and all this stuff, so you have to be really agile and almost as quick, as a forward in 7s versus in 15s, where 1 through 8 are the forwards and 9 through 15 are the backs. There's guys that are out there, they're 6'9" and 270 pounds that are playing block or 4 and 5 and doing things, and they're covering channels, but they're certainly not covering the field like a 7s forward would be.
So I'll take a step back and talk 15s because you did play Rugby Union. You were number 8. What was your responsibilities during that game?
What's funny when we're talking about numbers, the number 8 is probably the only position that wears the number 8 on its back, but it's also called that as well, right? It's the number 8. I mean, you're part of the back row, which is those of the scrum. You've got the 3 front row forwards, 1, 2, 3. The second row is the locks, 4 and 5. In essence, that's the modern day offensive line, right?
Okay.
That's the center, the 2 guards, and the 2 tackles. And then from there, the back row, of which the number 8 is 1, and the 2 flankers, 6 and 7, open side flanker and blind side flanker, that's the tight end meets linebacker group, right? That so you do a lot of that connectivity between the line and the and the backs in that regard. So yeah, I played number 8, and that was the number on my back end as well as that. So it's a really athletic meets physical position.
Now, you played American football in college, and you had the opportunity to play professional football. I believe you were offered a deal with the Minnesota Vikings, but you decided to go rugby. Why did you do that?
Yeah, it was kind of funny. Out of college, and I went to a small D1A school, or now championship school. So the likelihood of going pro, and I was training to be an Army officer, and I'd moved all around the country with my father and all around the world. So, grew kind of late, didn't really know what I wanted to do. Those were the options. And I got bigger and better and more physical and grew to a decent sized athlete and a decent sized capable athlete in college. So the sports world became more and more, well, maybe I'll do this. And so I had a few free agent tryouts and with the Redskins out of college, and those didn't really work out. And my first cousin was playing rugby for the Washington Rugby Club. And he said, "Hey, come stay fit with us." And back then there was no sports performance centers, right? There were no, all these, high performance centers that you could really kind of get stuck into and all that. And I was trying to do a lot of things. And so I started playing rugby and just felt like it was every sport I'd played growing up rolled into one. It just felt natural to me. I got seen by a few of the American national team people pretty quickly. So I was kind of made a project player, really, really quickly and started doing that. And funnily enough, rugby, the open chain running, the catching the ball, running, doing offensive, defensive, a lot of things. I probably became a better athlete, because I was doing more all round stuff. I was always in essence playing basketball on a field, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I always say to people. And basketball was my favorite sport growing up. I played soccer and basketball all the way through high school until I was 18. But basketball was kind of my favorite sport because I grew up in the kind of the Celtics, Lakers eras of the 70s, and
Right.
80s. So I really fell in love with that whole, fast-paced fluidity of the Lakers and the kind of the teamship of the Celtics. So there was just kind of that rivalry every year. And long story short, I was playing for the U.S. really quickly, playing on like Fox Sports International or something like that. You remember all those days back in your Universal days. And an agent and a guy saw me playing, and a guy named Gary Zahner, who was the special teams coach for the Minnesota Vikings, saw me and said, "Hey, I remember that guy from college," and called me up and said, "Hey, you want to come up to Minnesota for a tryout in the off season?" And I had not played football for 2.5 years. I had started playing rugby. I'd been doing that for a couple of years, and I went up there, and Denny Green was the head coach, and Mike Tice was the tight end coach, at the time.
Right.
And I absolutely slayed I killed the tryout. I ran as fast as I've ever run. I'm in the sub 4.7 for a 265 guy.
Wow.
And, I was catching balls and snapping and doing all kinds of stuff. And they offered me a contract, which I've got on my wall. And that's when the game of rugby was going professional overseas. And I played a match up in Canada maybe a couple weeks before that. And it was the first time the U.S. ever beat Canada in Canada. And I got the man of the match for the game. And there was a scout there from the English Premiership and from Bath, the club I signed for. And literally I had a contract to go play professional rugby and a contract to go play professional football sitting in front of me at the same time, which was some crazy stuff. And I've got both of them, in a frame, and I always say to people, I met my wife over there who's English, and I've got 3 boys and all that kind of stuff. So I made the right choice, doing what I did and all that regard. And, the NFL, nothing's guaranteed, right? You gotta make the team, and you gotta, get past the 3rd game, and you gotta do a lot of stuff. But all my buddies over here were like, "What are you doing?" They had no idea what rugby was, right? So to that degree. But that's how it all happened.
Okay, so that brings me to my next question about rugby. It's a growing sport here in the U.S., but outside the U.S., it's huge. Was it a culture shock for you when you went over there to play professionally?
Yeah, I suppose I was probably more international and more inclined to understand. I was in 13 places before I was 18. I knew what moving around was, and I knew how to acclimatize myself. I'd been in a military university and, went to airborne school and different things like that. So kind of knew how to take care of myself. Right. And I was probably a much better athlete than most of the guys that I came up against. I just had to learn how to play football. How to play rugby a little bit better, right? Compared to that. But I got really welcomed really quickly because I had a good work ethic and I knew how to be a pro because even college athletics is more of a pro environment than probably most environments around the world, right?
Right.
So I knew how to do all that stuff. I knew how to watch film and do things that those guys weren't used to doing, and so I was able to almost teach guys how to do that stuff while I was kind of learning some of the nuances of the game. And to be fair, we had a very open style of play, which allowed me to kind of use all of my athletic ability and cover up for any of the rugby that I didn't potentially know at the time. And I've always been a bit of a quick learner in that regard. So had early success over there after a couple of months, and just kind of never looked back at that point.
When I was at the tail end of Universal Sports Network, when NBC was coming in to purchase us, I had got sent over there to produce some vignette packages on the Rugby World Cup because it was taking place in England that year, and I got the chance to go to Rugby, which is a place in England, and found out about the history of the sport, and it was really interesting. And right around that time I was doing my research to go there, I found out that the United States won the first two Olympics that rugby was ever hosted, 1920 in Antwerp and 1924 in Paris, and both times they beat France. What is the history of rugby here for U.S. fans, and how do you grow that in your role now?
Yeah, for any people out there that are going to England, it's kind of part of that tourist triangle of London, Oxford, Stratford-on-Avon, Bath. That goes back through Stonehenge and Windsor. You can get on that as kind of an hour outside of London on the train. It's a pretty cool place,
Yeah.
and the rugby school is actually one of those big private schools like Eton and Harrow that everybody knows that, like Churchill and the Prince, William and Harry and all those folks went to. So it's a pretty cool place. And the World Rugby Hall of Fame is there. And the plaque, the William Webb Ellis Trophy, which
Right.
is like the Lombardi Trophy.
It's really
the plaque
cool.
there kind of, it just reads kind of in general disregard for the rules of the day. William Webb Ellis picked up the ball and ran with it. There's a little bit of myth to that, right?
Sure.
But, if you know the history of American football and soccer and all this stuff, as we kind of were talking about earlier, that's what football and soccer and rugby were just kind of all rolled into one over here, and the Boston rules, which is what Harvard played, versus the McGill rules, which is what McGill University in Montreal played, versus the Yale rules, which Walter Camp was modifying, and obviously he came up with the downs, in American football, having played this. So the point of saying all that stuff is that the game is super authentic in America because it's been around. It's the oldest sport on the campus of Cal Berkeley, 1882, right? Varsity sport. They're perennial national champions. There's others that, the Ivies and the military academies and, a lot of the schools out there that they've got 50 to 125 years of alumni, right? They've got so it's been around for a very long time. There's over 1,000 universities, men's and women's, that play the game, so it just didn't become part of the NCAA or the scholastic movement, and it probably had a chance to, but it was kind of more of a counterculture dialogue and reemerged in the 60s and 70s when there was that was the kind of the feeling of America at the time, this countercultural and American football player guys were playing football on a Saturday and playing rugby on a Sunday, or vice versa in the spring. They were just doing it, and their coaches weren't checking up on them. And obviously there was no internet and all that kind of stuff where they could be recorded. And there's some of the most famous football players of the 60s and 70s and early 80s actually played rugby at those times. And it was kind of a thing. And of course, for women, that was the first time that women, sports and other things really, in Title IX started taking over. And those first women's rugby teams started to be formed, and really in the advent of Title IX really became more and more popular, to the point now where the women's NCAA movement as an emerging sport is got significant legs. And I would envision in the next few years that it becomes a fully fledged women's NCAA sport because of that. But it's probably the most popular sport that Americans only come across when they're in college. And it's changing a little bit more because of the Olympic inclusion.
Yeah, and you talked about women in this sport. It's not something that I think traditionally we've thought of, that women would participate in kind of a more brutal sport. But So I've watched the New Zealand Silver Ferns play. When I was at the Olympics in Rio, they were staying at my hotel, so of course I had to get a picture of them, and they were great. Seeing how passionate they are about the sport and how dedicated they are, it's amazing that it's growing so fast. Why do you think that is for women?
Well, I think combining one of your questions earlier, which maybe I didn't answer fully. I mean, we play American football. That's our contact sport from a societal
Mm-hmm.
perspective. Rugby arguably is the world's contact sport, right? No one else really plays football, right? American football. So rugby is kind of that sport, and the cool thing about rugby is that there's no real difference, no difference in ball size, field size, number of players for men and for women, and there's probably, in the United States, there is no hockey and lacrosse are certainly very, very cool, physical sports, but kind of the easy to pick up, easy to play, rugby has got a real leg up on a lot of things once it's exposed in the right way and the right campuses, so I think it's a sport that people are drawn to because of the shared sacrifice side of things. Everyone says the physical side, the brutality side. It's really a game of space, right? You don't want to run at somebody unless you have to, right?
Mm-hmm.
But everyone's going to have to at some point. Everyone's going to have to get physical, and it becomes that a sport where there's a lot of teammateship, that it's predisposed. So I think a lot of people are drawn to that.
And you just mentioned, there is a little bit of a misperception of that brutality aspect of it, but it's one of the more safer sports as far as concussions go. And I know that Pete Carroll up with the Seattle Seahawks has brought rugby players in to teach them how to tackle properly. A lot of, because NFL's so fast and you have those pads, I think in my mind, not being a football player, they're just using those pads as leverage. So how does rugby factor into maybe American football?
Look, the science is still being developed on concussion and why and how and big hits, second hits, micro hits. There's a lot of dialogue going on about what that looks like and what's the likelihood. So, but because you have to wrap and you have to, in essence, which means you have to put your shoulder on somebody, which means you have to get your head out of the way. They call it cheek to cheek, face cheek to butt cheek. It feels inherently safer, right? Now people still move at fast paces, and you can't get your body into the right places
Sure.
and all that kind of stuff. Like anything, but the pure difference between rugby tackling and football tackling is that you have to wrap, right? You have to actually get your arms around somebody. You can't shoulder charge. You can't run into somebody, without doing that, right? And so, therefore, that inherently saferness is what it is by a long stretch. It's more successful. It's more practical, right? So these football coaches are like saying to themselves, okay, I got to teach my guys to get their head out of the tackle, because the less their head goes in the tackle, the better off they'll be from a safety perspective. But the reality is that if I get them to wrap somebody and I get them to shoulder leverage, as they call it in Seattle, the hawk tackle, or what Urban Meyer did, which was, hey, we're last in our conference or second to last in our conference in defensive tackle rate, and then you bring in rugby tackling structures, which he was like opposed to. He's like, well, why would we do this and all this stuff? And then you go on and you're the number one in the nation in set tackle rate, and you win a national championship. He just expounds it, right? So I think it's one of those things where rugby is mostly a spring sport. It probably has a favorable complementary strategy for rugby. If I'm a rugby coach or I'm a football coach, I'm gonna spend some time on high school campuses and college campuses with those folks, because you're ultimately going to become a better football player. Thinking about offensive linemen and defensive linemen and other guys opening up their stride and running all over the field, and just being that much more proprioceptively good at something, more athletic, let alone tackling, let alone all that ball handling that's there, all that close quarterness that's required, in football. So they super complement each other, and that's where there's been a lot of success at some high schools around the country, where they've got state championship football teams, and you look behind the scenes and they've got state championship rugby teams, and they're working together. The De La Salles and the Jesuits and things like that. They're just, it's funny how some of those things parallel.
Before we get into how rugby has been able to grow, I'd like to talk, if you can, a little bit about the culture and traditions of rugby, because I think they're really interesting. With New Zealand, they have the Haka, and I believe Fiji has, is it called the Haka as well in Fiji or in the Polynesian countries?
Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji have their own version of the Haka. They're called different things, but they're in essence the same. They do it for the same reasons, right? It's kind of a challenge, and what they do is that it's supposed to honor the team that they're playing, that they're willing to to lay down that challenge. It's kind of an ancestral dialogue that goes on, and each of them have different words and different overall literal meanings, but they're all meant to be a sign of respect.
And then within the game itself, it's a gentleman's game played by
hooligans.
Hooligans. What does that mean to you?
Or versus a hooligan game, played by gentlemen, right? So
right.
They say that difference between soccer. So soccer is a gentleman's game played by hooligans, and rugby's a hooligans game played by gentlemen. It's hard sometimes as a fan, and I'm a father, to watch soccer and even American football. Going to a American football game, you've got this tribalism and this parochialism that's kind of spills over into this kind of vitriol dialogue in the stands and things like that. And soccer has had that same thing, but it's spilled its way onto onto the field, right? And you're just hearing players talk to referees and others at different times. And I think that everybody within those sports don't want that, right? And that's gone all the way down to, Friday night tykes, in American football, where it's, hit and hurt him and all that kind of stuff. And I think as a culture in today's society with we're all on social media and we're seeing things and it's reactionary and all that kind of stuff. I think rugby has a place in helping society because it's not just something that's part of the sport. It's required that you have to call the referee, sir, right? Sir, ma'am. Hey, you have to shake hands with the opposition afterwards. You have to not just shake hands. You got to clap them off. You have to, it's the coach's jobs. The coaches aren't on the sideline yelling at the referees, right? They're supposed to be, like in the professional game. They're up in the stands, and they're trying to create a difference between the players playing the game and the referee, being part of that dialogue, and certainly the language and the culture and all that stuff. Things happen, but it's policed to where the culture of the game is. If player welfare is 1A should be of number one priority, then 1A in rugby is the culture and the values.
All right, I'm talking with Dan Lyle, director of rugby for AEG. Dan, this is kind of a whirlwind we've all been thrown in the sports world with COVID-19. So I want to just pretend that that's not happened with any sport. There's a lot of sports out there. There's some new sports emerging. There's esports now. There's a lot of different sports out there. How have you been able to grow rugby in the United States?
Unfortunately, it's grown haphazardly, right? The organic growth that is usually personality driven. Some individual starts a club. We talked about that 60s and 70s time frame where colleges started coming back into the fray, and more came from there, which means we're kind of in our second or third generation of rugby players in the United States, that outside of all of those early teams that started back in the late 1800s and went through to the Olympic Games and, in those first games. And that system or that organic growth that's been happening, because we live on a continent, in every state. It's like living, I always say, well, what's it like to grow rugby in America? It's like growing rugby from Ireland to Istanbul, right? There's a lot of different people and a lot of different climates and cultures and so forth. And so if it's rooted now in colleges, the idea was to grow and broaden the base. And it became in the late 90s and early 2000s because it was it was in these universities, and it's a pretty inexpensive sport. It started to grow pretty fast at the high school level because all those folks that were graduating colleges in the 60s and 70s were now kind of in the in their 30s and 40s and the 80s and 90s were okay. I've got kids now, and instead of waiting till they get to college, let's get some programs. And it's always had like soccer, it's had an expat affiliation, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
coastal structures and people were the South Africans and Australians and Polynesian communities and so forth on the West Coast, and the Brits and the Irish and the French, and those were in the and then pockets in different places. And so it's really been, that's what I mean. It's been haphazard, in an approach for a very long time. And the game went professional in 1996, really late. They've had games that for forever.
Professional globally, you're talking, right?
Professionally globally, right? And so of course
Interesting.
for the United States, that's when I had those two contracts sitting in front of me, with the
Mm-hmm.
Vikings and with Bath in England. And so it's really only kind of in its maybe 1.0, 1.5 level of maturity, right? Think about all the different evolutions of the game of football in America, and baseball and basketball, and all the different mergers and different groups, and these franchises were successful and these weren't, and these startup leagues and all that stuff. So it's really kind of new, and so therefore it is it's kind of in its it's always grown, rooted in our university systems, and then individually, personality, haphazardly below that.
With rugby now, at least from my experience as being in broadcasting, it's about creating interest somehow and getting those athletes that can really be the face of a sport. And the two people that come to my mind immediately, because Rugby Sevens was more focused, and I think you know who I'm going to be talking about here, is Perry Baker and Carlin Isles, who have, well, at least Carlin Isles, they consider the fastest man in rugby. But creating the face of rugby, is that part of the strategy, or is that more challenging to find?
Yeah,
I kind of went all over the place there. Sorry.
no. It's a great question, because the haphazard growth of America is a kind of an all over answer. First and foremost, the Olympic Sevens dialogue, and Carlin and Perry, and I'll add Alev Kelter and Naya Tapper, who are the same type of crossover athletes on the women's side, because our teams are the top three in the world. We have more natural athletes. We're dripping with natural talent over here, right? There's
Right.
so many athletes in America, and so few post 22-year-old environments that they can go to and continue to compete in. And so the American sports system is rooted in scholastic, so after school programs that lead to scholastic high school programs, that lead to collegiate programs, that lead to professionalism and or the Olympics, right? That is the American sports complex. And you have philanthropic and entrepreneurs and companies that get involved in that for all things. In 2009, America, we went to a state-based model for the very first time for youth and high school, and that meant that each state could concentrate on growing the youth and high school movements. And there's one state in America, Massachusetts, that is officially a school sport, right? There. So you got 49 more states to go,
Mm-hmm.
men and women to go there. But it also in 2009 was when rugby got back into the Olympics, right? For the Rio Olympics, as you pointed out. But 7 years later, that's a seminal moment, because that is where Americans they understand things, right? They understand, where do I play rugby? Well, you play for your state, right? Or in your state
Right.
for your high school or whatever. And they understand the Olympics. That's the way that we all grow up. Certainly we're more international than that now, right? With all types of other sports. And you lived and breathed a lot of those at Universal Sports. But so sevens as the Olympic sport, and those faces, rugby, NBC came calling in 2009 and said, hey, let's create some content. What is it that we can latch onto to start building the value proposition for the Olympics for Americans, right? So those people have more value, more face recognition than the 15s game, where a couple of dozen of those guys and are playing abroad, and are doing very, very well, like I did in a Premiership or in France and some of the better leagues in the world, right? So, but sevens is certainly because it's easy to understand. It's perfect for the American attention span
Sure.
in a lot of ways. It's
Yeah.
great for television, all that kind of stuff. Is a real gateway for the game.
What does the future look like then, from your perspective? Having a hand in making it happen. What is the future of rugby in the U.S.?
The start of that state-based model and the Olympics was the start of legitimizing the game, institutionalizing the game, right? So, you need to have a map of the United States, and you need to say, okay, well, in 2030, we're going to have 25 states that are going to have adopted men and women's soccer at scholastic level. And 2035, we're going to have 40 of those. And so you really expand the base. You get more and more people the knowledge of how to enter the sport, what it looks like. That therefore is pumping more people into college, so that the college can improve its standards and its numbers. Because it's not like you need a ton more colleges playing the game. You've got a lot of them. You just need there's a more and a better strategy there, right? And then that pushes down into if more high schools have the game, then there's more people pushing and doing after school programs, and they can see a legitimate side of things. So there's a lot of money at the grant level and the after school program level in a lot of cities, but they need a vision. They need to see where it's all going to go, right? And companies want to be involved in that level as well. So I really feel like it's really putting really strong targets on that number. And then your product at the national team level gets better because you've got more and better coming out of the youth and high school ranks. Now, we've also have a 2-year-old Major League Rugby, which is a professional league that's happening. Certainly you need to be able to be pumping out, 300 athletes a year, in order to populate the 30 for your national team. You need good quality competition that's improving. You need, that conversation, and all that stuff is going to be tied together. And I think that it's all been separated for a very long time, right? There, as I said before, it's all been personality driven. So as rugby looks at itself in the mirror, it's got to say to itself, well, how is it that we believe we can grow that is conducive to how most sports in America grow, perceived, and are valued.
Now, the Rugby Sevens World Cup has been hosted here in the U.S., and there's talk of trying to bid for the 2027 Rugby World Cup if everything goes well with what we're living through right now. What's been your experience with those events in getting people to be more interested in it?
The challenge is that the Rugby World Cup for 15s, every 4 years, the U.S. men's team is not very competitive, right? In that. And so give me the perception that we can win or have the opportunity. That's been the biggest challenge. And you need to play, you need more and better players and more and better competition. So that's the MLR meets the growing of the foundation, the base, and the growing of certain programs. That is a huge financial undertaking, for any nation that does it. And certainly in America, it's a unique proposition because government doesn't finance like it does in many other places, right?
Right.
They're privately driven, and and 1994 for America was a seminal moment in America because it allowed for the launch of professional soccer by way of the MLS, and people came together, and it was probably the most attended still to this day event. I think that MLS went through some evolutions of renting other people's stadiums, owning their own stadiums, how they develop their players, what the pay-to-play model looks like. I think women's soccer is kind of in that same place where we've got a hugely successful national team, but maybe, high school, because we have a hugely successful collegiate system, and but college soccer players don't, that those aren't the guys that are playing in the MLS anymore, right? So is rugby's goal to have a World Cup, unlock a system or penetrate the system that's American, have a nest egg off the back of that, use that as a target for sponsors and for broadcasters and all that stuff. All that stuff needs to be laid out, against the financial model on the back of that has got to be sustainable, because that money ultimately will run out if you don't create a sustainable product, right? So I think it's well worth investigating that dialogue. It's hard to see 27 because you've got this little old thing called the Soccer World Cup in 26 and this little old thing called the Olympic Games in 28 in LA, and sandwiched in between that, does that take all the oxygen out of the room for sponsors and other people like that? And I know the Women's World Cup, is also a something soccer wise is something that they're also contemplating as well in that kind of that 27 window. So, and you want a competitive team. So will you have a competitive team by 27? So you've got to create the building block. So feasibility and bidding over the course, I think it's going to be over the next year and a half, is 100% worth doing, and then layering that into what the plans are leading into that and potentially leading out of it.
Sounds like you have a challenge that you're probably ready to face, but I'm sure there's going to be some roadblocks along the way.
Yeah, AEG, we're a principal. We like to build stuff, right? We like to build buildings and leagues and teams and partner with people. And we like to think of ourselves as agnostic and, doing a lot of things with a lot of different people in a lot of different genres, even people that are looked at as potentially as competitors to ours. We work with in lots of different fashions on a global basis. And I think what all of that sums up to be is that we and others, we entice people to invest in things, time, energy, and money. We want to entice people to invest in the game, domestically and internationally, right? We have tons and tons of experiences of running leagues and venues and commercial relationships around the world. So it's not just a U.S. domestic conversation. It's about how can you make better this sport, on different continents, of which we operate on all of them.
All right, let's change gears slightly. We're still staying within rugby, but you are the analyst for NBC Sports with rugby. How did that come about, and what do you enjoy about it?
Well, it's probably I was the only man standing, at some point, right? Although I like to ramble on a little bit, and broadcasting is more about word efficiency, particularly in rugby where you don't get a lot of time, right? To do stuff. You don't have a lot of programming around it to talk about the sport too much. I was a guy that had a lot of experience and working with Universal and then with NBC and their team there, in introducing them to rugby, and really kind of being someone that they could lean on for rights acquisitions and other things. It just became a natural kind of progression to talk about it, and I probably talk more like a GM than I do like a former player. I probably talk more about, and less about the X's and O's, and I really enjoy the X's and O's and of the side of the thing. And I think to sum it up, it probably is that it's competitive, right? It's performance driven. You got to do it on the spot. People don't realize that it's constant. There's a lot of flexibility in live sports, right? And you got to, adapt as it comes along and, summarize and then be able to change things and, play off of other people. So it almost feels like you're a player to a certain degree. So it kind of fills a little bit of those competitive juices, that are also out there. So look, I really enjoy it. I do a little bit for MLR and I do a little bit for one or two of the other groups, and that's rightly so because it's NBC is the leader and the home of rugby in America by a long stretch. But as we grow the sport, it won't be the only one, for it, and it's an industry leader in a lot of different ways, and because it's the Olympic and the Rugby World Cup home, happy to be part of it, no doubt.
Now, for somebody who might be new to rugby, and they don't have an expat to watch rugby with to kind of explain the game, how would you recommend someone watch rugby to try and maybe accelerate their learning and appreciation for that sport?
Well, I think if anybody in any sport is watching the ball, that they'll get a sense of, okay, well, that ball needs to go into that basket, right? Or
Right.
that football needs to get over that goal line. So if you fundamentally understand that, but those are all possession games, right? You wouldn't turn the ball over for no reason, right? Where in rugby, it becomes a territory game at times, right? You're in your own what they call 22 or inside your own half, and you've got less guys on their feet than the other team, and you're going to decide to kick the ball away to either gain territory or kick to go get the ball back again, right? So right then and there's a complexity to it, right? Okay, well, what am I doing? And then, okay, well, why doesn't somebody just go pick up the ball as they're running back? And so the offsides line that's formed every time there's a tackle, right? That forms that ruck or that ball. That's the second complexity, right? It's like,
Yeah.
why are they all running all over the place, and doing that stuff, right? And so, what you have to say to people is that the objective is still get the ball over the line. But how you get there, there's a couple of different ways of doing it, and it's certainly in sevens, possession is key. So they generally don't ever kick the ball away, right? And they generally don't do that very often, right? So that's why it's more akin to an American audience dialogue. And you can see the option quarterback and the fast break, point guard mentality all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
15s is much like somebody from abroad watching an American football game and like, what are they doing, right? And who's doing? Why are they doing that? And who, they haven't snapped the ball yet. Why is that guy going in motion? And who's that? So inherently, you've got to get some of the nuances of the game before you're, at least in the 15s code side of it, before you're able to enjoy it.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here a couple of times. First, who are some of your favorite all-time rugby players that people should know about from a historical perspective and maybe even from a current perspective?
Well, they just had his 45th birthday, and unfortunately, he passed away. And he was the global star, the world leader in so many different ways. Jonah Lomu,
Mm-hmm.
who I played with and against. So we played with him. He was a New Zealand All Black against with the Barbarians, which is a kind of world all-star team, and I was lucky to play on that a couple of times with him, and then play against him, and just see the sheer, a 265-pound man running a sub 11 100 meters is just a
Wow.
remarkable sight to be seen. And so, the Will Carling, the captain of England, just called him a freak, right? And that wasn't really the best compliment, but it's almost the best way of describing how good he was, right? It played a lot of rugby in the English Premiership, and there was a flanker that won the England World Cup played for Saracens and played for England when they won the World Cup in 2003, Richard Hill. And so he was in the back row and he was probably the guy that I had the most tussles with and, respected, on a week in and week out, just thought he was an unsung guy, which was really, really good at the game. And my own teammates, I played with two of the best that played for England, and Mike Catt, who, in my opinion, was just one of the most well-rounded players that has ever played the game. And he's an assistant coach of in Ireland now for the Ireland national team and so forth. And then the guy that I just thought was better than anybody because he made it look so good, and I probably would tell you that as well, was a guy named Jeremy Guskett, who was played in the centers for England and played center for Bath, and just probably one of the all-time greats. And he was one of those guys that was like a 200-meter runner. Remember how Michael Johnson used to run the 200-meter where
Mm-hmm.
you didn't think he was running, but he was just super fast,
right?
Because it was so, efficient, in the way that he did things. Anyway, those are three guys, and and there's a lot of guys, my own teammates on the U.S. team, that I have the utmost respect for and love playing, and because it's such a team game. But those are generally the four that are just kind of stood out in my career. There's a lot of guys that worked hard, and I loved playing with, traveling with, touring with, rooming with, partying with, but those are the four main ones.
It's a sport that I've really come to love, and like you said, we all played some form of it when we were younger. When it was snowing outside, just get a ball and go smash each other, and whoever doesn't get hurt wins. So sports in the making, I like to get into the behind the scenes on how things work, and try and help people appreciate what goes into creating sports and sports broadcasting. There's a movie that I watched recently. And by recently I say in the last 10 years, and that was Invictus. So Invictus was about the 1995 World Cup. Would you say that that's a really good film for people to watch to maybe understand the culture, not just politically, but just the culture of rugby?
Yeah, the movie Invictus was powerful as a story. The rugby was probably just okay, from a purist perspective. Matt Damon didn't do anything wrong, but the kind of as playing Francois Pienaar, who I know very, very well, who's the South African captain, played against him on a few occasions. The rugby wasn't the purest, but using sport as Nelson Mandela, played by Morgan Freeman, did to absolutely, rugby was the white sport, right? It was the apartheid sport. It
Right.
epitomized brutality to every single Black African, South African particularly, and it was unbelievably powerful and with such foresight that Nelson Mandela could take a sport that was, as I said, despised by the population. The Springbok emblem was spit on, by Black South Africans, and used that as a unifying principle to say, hey, look, if we're all going to do this, we all got to come together, and why not start with this sport? And if I can do it, and if I put on the jersey of the captain, Francois Pienaar, the number 6 jersey, the flanker, we talked about before, the numbers, and wore that, and just kind of drove home that we all have to come together, the Rainbow Nation, in that regard. The really, really cool thing about that was real as waking up every morning and having a good cup of coffee. I mean, it is real, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was powerful, and it did that. Is that there were young people that saw that, and the South African national team just won the World Cup in Japan. So the first time the Rugby World Cup was outside of a traditional country, in Asia for the first time, in Japan. Japan played unbelievable, got to the quarterfinals, but South Africa beat England in that final comprehensively.
Mm-hmm.
And the captain of the South Africa team was Siya Kolisi. Siya Kolisi was the first Black man to ever captain South Africa. And he held the William Webb Ellis Trophy up, just like Francois Pienaar did with Nelson Mandela, in South Africa in 1995. And the change, even though there's continued strife, continued economic things, the evolution of things is continuing. That personified why Mandela did that, and that was just, and he won, by way of him being that person and him being inspirational, and that team coming together and playing so well, won so many sports trophies around the world because of that connection. It's something that every sportsman should look up. Watch Invictus, and then watch just the award ceremony of the Rugby World Cup in Japan from this last fall.
It's just amazing how sports can be so powerful in that, and so that's why you're in it. That's why I'm involved in it, and that's why millions of people love it. So a couple more questions, because I only have a few more minutes with you. What would you like people to know about rugby that they might not otherwise know?
Well, I think the game is inherently known by Americans. We know the game. When we see it, we kind of inherently know what they're trying to do, right? As we talked about before, the complexities are there, and that it is so. It helps, people overcome, any of their whatever their backgrounds are. When you get on a rugby field as a boy or a girl, you immediately are part of a team, and I think that is and a lot of sports say that, and we play a lot of sports, and they all have a lot of driving principles. But I think rugby has as a special way because of the culture and the values, and that everybody passes and catches, and everybody tackles, and as I said, it's the same for boys and girls. It really has a inherent value system, an inherent way of engendering itself once you play the game. The issue is that we just haven't exposed it enough, right? It hasn't had regular broadcasting. It hasn't had regular seasonality. It hasn't had, wasn't part of the American sports complex. So it's one of those things that is once you see it, and once you're encased in it, you're probably going to like it. And then as we become more international as a country, as we look to more of a broader aspects of who we are as a country, rugby is one of those sports that allows us to do it and do it in the right ways. Combat and compete and do all those things, but then at the end of the day, shake each other's hands.
That's good stuff. Finally, what's the best advice you've been given working in sports?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, to me is there's a saying that the University of California has that all of their players in rugby have a mantra for, which is entitled to nothing and grateful for everything, and that is an interesting motto. When you're playing a physical sport and you're playing a team sport, and then I played for the U.S. team for a decade, and a lot of different places around the world, and representing your country, and and doing all the things that you do there. The awarding of the jersey is the beginning of the battle, right? Once you get the jersey, that's when it starts. It's not, and it takes a ton to get the jersey, right? All the preparation, all the you got to become the best of the best in order to do that, but that's when it starts. And so I think that we all work hard to get to places, where we can accomplish things. But then is when it all starts, right? Then you're in the crucible. Then is when, and so sports is a place where you have to do all the work to get there, and then you have to perform at that point, right? And so I think that's what sports teaches you, is that there's two phases to all this, and then look how you react to winning and losing, and how you're results driven and performance driven. All those things is why sportsmen talk in front of business leaders and say, well, this is what we do, and all that kind of stuff, because the preparation and all that stuff leads to the performance and the results. And I would say that probably that simplicity of that results and performance matter, but you're only as good as your preparation, and because that's a tangible thing, in sports, because you'd wake up the next morning after a game and there'd be a number next to your name, of how you performed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, were you a 5? Were you a 7? Were you a 9? That kind of stuff. It's pretty tangible, in a lot of ways, so I think you learn that there's a couple of different phases to getting better, sustainability, and being good at what you do.
So finally, if there's anyone who wants to know more about what's happening in rugby here in the U.S., how can they find out more?
USARugby.org is a great resource. You can find clubs, find a club, find a place, or if you're in a state, you can just Google, like I'm in Colorado, or if you're in California or wherever you may be, just, put California Rugby or Colorado Rugby, and you'll find your state-based organization that will be able to, steer you towards the right place. And we're slowly coming out of our shells, and I think it's I think the Olympic movement and, in this broader value system of wanting kids to learn things and be respectful of each other and referees and coaches, and this international vision that we have, for ourselves as a country and each other, to become more receptive and diverse and bigger than ourselves, is why I think, rugby has got a real good future for ourselves. Organizationally, we've got to adapt, but it's got all the hallmarks for a sport that you'd want your child to play. Yes, it's physical. Yes, there's some inherentness to it that's anything else, but certainly think it's that shared sacrifice mantra that is and that teamsmanship. Man, that's some pretty cool stuff.
Well, it's a sport, as I mentioned before, that I've come to love, and I thank you for coming on with me, because I've learned a lot more about what you're doing for rugby, and a little bit more of the history and how everything works together. So thank you for your time, Dan, and best of luck growing this amazing sport here in the U.S. in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
All right, that was Dan Lyle, Director of Rugby at AEG. Dan's got a lot of work in front of him in growing the sport here, but with his background and his passion for it, I have a feeling he'll get it done sooner than later. Now, I've had the chance to produce a number of rugby events here in the US, and it truly is an amazing sport with a lot of really interesting nuances to the game as well. It's also got traditions that are amazing to see, and it's a huge club sport with a lot of history, so I'm excited to see its growth here. Rugby Sevens and Rugby Union are a lot of fun to watch, the fans are great, and there are some hard hits as well, and all without pads, by the way. If you have the chance to watch the movie Invictus with Matt Damon and Morgan Freeman, it's a compelling story that made an impact on history through rugby, so if you have a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. I look forward to you joining me on the next Sports in the Making podcast to find out about the people who put sports together and to hear some of their stories working behind the scenes. Sports is slowly starting to get clicking again, and let's hope that everything opens back up completely for the rest of the year and beyond. If you have any suggestions on what you'd like to know more about in sports, drop me a line at sportsinthemaking.com or contact me on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, I'd love to include them in a future episode with your name. Wherever you listen to this podcast, I'd appreciate it if you like it, share it, and leave positive reviews on your social media channels. Also, be sure to subscribe to Sports in the Making so you don't miss out on more episodes, and you can catch up on previous ones there as well. I'm your host, Don Cardona. Thank you for listening to Sports in the Making.